All right. Well, we have started this series to look at some of the Old Testament prophets. Now, the reminder, Old Testament is before Jesus came, before New Testament. We're in the Old Testament. Isaiah spoke around 800 BC. So that'd be like 800 years before the Gospels narrative starts. And Jeremiah is going to be close to around 600 BC. So a little bit later than now. Remember, we're going backwards for BC. You're going from the larger numbers to one, and then there's no year zero. I didn't know that. I learned that one new. There was no year zero. It was one to one. So you're going that way. So 800 BC is farther back than the 600 BC. And then we move up. Christ is born somewhere around 3 AD, somewhere around there, and crucified around 33 to 36, somewhere in there. So that's kind of the timeline we're working with. Now, Jeremiah's an interesting book because it does not go in chronological order, making it really hard to read because it jumps around all over the place. Now, luckily, we're not reading the entire book today. We're just going to tackle those few verses there. But before we jump in, I gotta introduce you to somebody whose name I can't pronounce because he's Hungarian. Ignaz. Isn't that a cool name? How many people here know someone named Ignaz? I have never even heard of this name before today. Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian doctor in Vienna, and he had a problem. He had actually a really big problem. He kind of oversaw a bunch of doctors that helped deliver babies. And the problem they had, this is in the later 1800s, mid 1800s, is that 1 in 5 women were dying after childbirth because they would get a fever that they couldn't get healed from. And so this is a big problem. There's a 20% chance you're not going to make it if you give birth. Everyone gives birth. Like all the women of the day, they gave birth. That's just what they did. So 1 in 5 women were getting sick and dying. And Ignaz thought this is not cool. We can't have this. But he noticed something. If a woman gave birth with a midwife instead of a doctor, their percentage of survival went from 20% chance of dying to one. That's a big difference, isn't it? You go from 1 in 5 to 1 in 100. That's a big difference. It's a very big difference. And he was wondering, what are these midwives doing that none of their women would get a fever at all, and only 1 out of 100 would die because of childbirth. And he thought that they got something going on, and I can't tell what it is. So he started to study the ways of the midwives. Now, in a very like patriarchal culture where the doctors were all men and they basically were all the educated, manly, understanding, mansplaining people, they didn't really value midwives at all. But these midwives were unsung heroes because their survival rate was near 100%. So Ignaz decided to study what these midwives were doing that possibly was different than the doctors. And he found one thing that stood out that gave their survival rates way more than the doctors. The one thing. Anyone want to take a guess? They washed their hands. It's as simple as that. They washed their hands. They made sure that they were clean when they were going to be delivering a child. So he said, "No way. Wow." Now, this is before, we knew about a lot of germs and all that. Germ theory was all that crazy science that nobody believed in, kind of a thing. They were like, but Ignaz was like, well, these midwives actually have the numbers to prove that they're onto something. So he started to wash his hands with a chlorinating solution before delivering children, babies, sorry. And he noticed that his survival rates skyrocketed and the women were not getting fevers and dying. So the other doctors were kind of mocking him and saying, "You can't learn from those lady. They don't have education like we do. They don't understand the things we do." He's like, "No, they actually got a point. I have been washing my hands like they do, and I've all my numbers, they're increasing. Your numbers are the same. You're losing 1 in 5 women. I'm losing 1 in 100." And so the doctors kind of mocked him for years, but he introduced it into his practice, and the evidence was just too much to ignore. And now we have wash in and wash out as mandatory practices in hospitals, all to the thanks not of Ignaz. He didn't invent that. He just found out that the midwives were the ones who figured that out. And then he gets the credit for it. But all thanks to the midwives, because they are the ones who practiced that cleanliness. But they were the outsiders. They weren't on the inside elite club of the doctors who were the educated and knew how to do all the things and were then the mocking. Nope. They were on the outside, but they had something that they understood as being valuable. Ignaz was like, yep, they got a point. And now unfortunately, we don't know the names of any of those midwives, but we do for Ignaz. But he's the one that then brought that wisdom out for other doctors, and they started to practice it, and survival rates started to go up. Because sometimes people on the inside don't have the perspective to critique the thing that they're involved in. Correct? We all know that. That's basic wisdom. Midwives were on the outside, and they're like, wow, all those doctors keep killing all of their patients, so we're going to wash our hands. And then all of a sudden, those outsiders, the wisdom got onto the inside and changed the system. That's how it works. Jeremiah is an outsider. He's an outsider. We got to understand this thing about Jeremiah. He's an outsider. He's from a small town named Anathoth. That is really hard to pronounce. Anathoth. But Anathoth is a town with a lot of history, very interesting history. A few centuries before Jeremiah, King David, we all know King David, fought Goliath and all that jazz. King David, leader of Israel, he was trying to figure out a succession plan for his throne. Now, remember, he took over from Saul, who was a pretty bad king, and then David comes in, pretty decent king, made some mistakes, but overall, when you compare him to other kings, he was a pretty decent guy. And he's trying to figure out a succession plan. Who's going to take my place? And he had two sons vying for attention. Oh, yeah, there they are. Actual footage of them. No. Now, David's wife, Bathsheba, lots of history with that one, she wanted her son Solomon to be the king. But David's other son, Adonijah, that's a cool name, Adonijah, he wanted it for himself. He didn't want his brother Solomon to get the king. He wanted it for himself. He was older. It was like, this should be mine because I'm the older son. And Bathsheba's like, well, I want my son to be king. So this caused a division that split the nation into two factions. That tends to happen quite a bit with nations. But it split them into two factions. One under this prophet Nathan, who supported Solomon and said, yep, he's our guy. Another was under the prophet Abathar, and he supported Adonijah. So we got two kings vying for the throne, and then two prophets that come in and say, I will speak for God. My side says this. So we got a faction here. Both sides are claiming that they're hearing from God. Both sides are saying, no, my guy is the guy that should be on the throne. And Nathan is the one prophet over on Solomon, and Abathar supported the other one. Solomon eventually took the throne, so he won. And then what do you think you do when there's a faction and then you gain the power? You're like, oh, come back in, my brothers. It's all a big loving family. No, that didn't happen. It never happens that way. You then take the power that you have and then you weaponize it against the people who are against you. And he exiled all of those priests who didn't support him, including that man named Abathar, who was the guy who was kind of saying, no, I promote Adonijah. And he exiled them to a small city outside Jerusalem named Anathoth. Oh, this is the same town that Jeremiah is from. So when the passage opens up, it's like, oh, Jeremiah from the town of Anathoth. We're just like, that's a city I don't understand. they're going to be like, oh, the history of that place. Good Lord. I remember when that happened, or I've heard the stories about when that happened, right? So he exiled all the priests that supported Adonijah, including Abathar, to that small city outside Jerusalem named Anathoth. Now, 200 years later, a man named Jeremiah was born into that exiled priestly family. Now, I like this picture of Jeremiah. I think it captures a little bit of his ethos. And it opens up with, in verse 1, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. All of that, we just tend to like skim on by and like, well, where's the good stuff? Because we don't really understand the history of all the words that are there. This book opens up with this powerful line, and then the readers who had originally heard this would be like, oh, it's that guy from that family in that town, all those exiled outsider priests. So Jeremiah is not an insider. He's not a priest in Jerusalem under the authority of the king. He's not there. He's outside. He's in Anathoth. Now, Isaiah, if you remember him last week, he was an insider. He became a whistleblower. He was like 100 and some years before Jeremiah. Jeremiah is not the insider whistleblower. He's the outsider who decided to speak up right around 627 BC. And he was about 17 years old. 17 years old. Like, he doesn't even know how to do a stick shift yet. And he's being asked to step into a role that is really like high up. So he's going to serve for 40 years. He's going to serve under 5 kings, and he's going to see the nation through its most devastating tragedy that it ever endured. And that was when the Babylonian Empire invaded from the north, destroyed the entire town of Jerusalem and the temple, and sent all the people into exile in Babylon in 587 BC. So Jeremiah is serving under 5 kings, and he sees that dead end, and he's like, guys, we got to do something before this happens. And nobody's listening to him. He's the outsider that has that perspective, and nobody's listening to him, but he ends up being right, proven right in the worst way. If you've ever been that person that's like, I see some bad stuff that might happen if we don't change this, and then the bad stuff happened, and it's like, I told you so. Jeremiah could be the patron saints of the I told you so crowd, I think. Maybe, possibly. But anyways, there's another faction that happens inside the place, and not under kings this time, but under priests. Now we got the royalists versus the Yahwists. Again, this is actual picture of the two guys. They were ready to go. Not really. I didn't. There's no pictures, but that's the best I can come up with. The royalists versus the Yahwists. This is a faction that rose up in the prophets. There were two kinds of prophets in the day. There was the royalists and the Yahwists. Now, prophets were political figures, and they divided into these two groups, royalists and Yahwists. And the royalists were those who were loyal to the throne and the temple. That was their thing. Like, we got to honor the king and the throne, and whatever he says is what God says. And then we'll just say yes to that. And then the temple system, whatever the temple's doing, absolutely awesome. So that's what their whole mindset, their whole existence, everything rotated around the throne and the temple. And then there was the Yahwists who rose up, and they were faithful to the Mosaic law. That would have been the first 5 books of the Bible that was given in 1446 BC, somewhere around there. And they're like, no, it says in the book that we should be doing this and this and this and this. And they're like, that doesn't totally matter because the king says this and this and this and this. So these two factions are fighting each other. Jeremiah is kind of caught up in the middle of this. The royalists focus on political religious structures that they built over the previous centuries, and their faithfulness to the throne gave them a blind spot because then they could ignore the evils that were done by the king and only praise their works that they did and say, oh, God condones this, blesses this, and is great. Those were what the royalists did. The Bible ends up calling them false prophets. Not because they're frauds, but because they're the propaganda spreaders of the throne and the temple system that they were built. So they were end up being false prophets because they say, oh, God likes this. God loves what we're doing. God is blessing all this stuff. Now, um, those who justify with God's blessings the words and actions of the kings ended up being the royalists. And then the Yahwists were those who desired faithfulness to the written law handed down by Moses. These were two factions within there. And they were often exiled and or executed by kings. Elijah was a famous one that was exiled because the royalist prophet tradition were like, yeah, King Ahab can't do no wrong. He's amazing. He's great. He's wonderful. But then the Bible says he was one of the most wicked kings that ever existed. And the Yahwists come in and say, well, you've broken this law and this law and this law and this law, and it's not good. So you can see how these two things, but this faction started 100 years prior to Jeremiah. There was a very righteous king. The Bible describes him. His name was Hezekiah. He had a really good reign, and he's probably praised as one of the more righteous kings in the whole lineage of the history of those people. And when his reign ended, it swung so far the other way. We went from the most righteous to the most wicked king recorded in there. His name was Manasseh. And he was so wicked that he performed things like child sacrifice and worshiping of idols in the temple and all this other stuff. It was like the darkest days of their history that lasted 45 years under his reign. And then when his son took the throne, he was worse than his dad, so bad that his own servants on the inside were like, we got to off this guy. And they assassinated him after barely 2 years of being the king. They're like, this guy's so bad, we got to get rid of him. So they just offed him. They killed him. They assassinated him. They were like ninjas in the night. I don't know how they did it, but that's what happened. His name was Amam. Now, who takes his place? We got Hezekiah, good king. Then we got Manasseh, bad king, 45 years. Amam, bad king for 2 years, assassinated. Who's going to take his place? A little boy. Isn't he so cute? He's so cute. He's 8 years old. Can you imagine being put in charge of an entire nation and people at the age of 8? That'd be a little crazy. His name was Josiah, but he ended up being one of the more righteous kings ever recorded. Now, some Talmud writers, these are some of the traditionalists, they said that Manasseh's reign and Amam's reign was so wicked that cobwebs developed on the altar of God because it was never used. Like that's how like bad it was. Somewhere in that time of those wicked kings, the power shifted from the Yahwists to the royalists. And now the royalists are like, yeah, these guys are great. And they lost the law. They lost the book of the law that told them this is what God says you are to do and be about. You imagine being in a church that like never used the Bible and they're like, wait, there's a book? Like, really? And it's like, yeah. And then some guy finds the book in a storage room in the temple. He's like, what's this? And then he dusts it off and he's like, whoa, this is like the law. This is the words of God to us, giving us instruction. It got lost in that time when they had a wicked king and everything was used. Everything was like, no, it's all about just supporting the king and what the king does, and we just love what the king says. The whole book got lost. And then this guy named Hilkiah found it. He was a priest serving, he like served in the temple and he's going through a storage closet for some reason. And he pulls it out and he's like, what's this? Oh, this is the law of God. This is the words of God to our people telling us what we ought to do. And he brings it to Josiah, this king. And then he does all these reforms. He's like, no, we got to get back to the Yahwist tradition, get rid of this royalist tradition. Do you know who Hilkiah was? It was Jeremiah's dad. Jeremiah's dad is the one who found the book of the law in the temple, and then helped lead all these traditional reforms inside of the thing, moving from the royalist tradition back to being faithful to God's traditions handed out in the law. That was Jeremiah's dad. Can you imagine like stepping into that shadow? Like you're the guy that found the Bible after it was lost for like 100 years. Like that would just be like, oh, your dad was great. That was awesome when your dad did the thing. Now Jeremiah, at 17 years old, God's like, your turn. He's like, whoa. You don't understand. I'm just a little boy. I can't do this stuff. I'm like, I'm 17. I don't even know how to drive my car yet. Like, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, Jeremiah eventually says yes, um, but he then sees the next five kings through their reign to the end of their whole nation. Now, here's a little bit of a map of what's going on in the world at the time. There was Babylon up to the north, and there was Egypt to the south. Who's stuck right in the middle of that? Yes, that would be the people of Judah. They're stuck right in the middle between two superpowers. They're just a tiny little nation. They're just little tiny little nation, but they're on the highway that connects north and south. Can you imagine being like stuck in between like two people that are about to go to war with each other, and you're just a little tiny nation that's in the way? So he's got to try and lead these kings through like this. Well, you want to like, serve Egypt and make all these alliances with Egypt. You want to do it with Babylon. They go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over these five kings. The very last king, um, he actually betrayed Babylon and went over to Egypt. And Babylon was like, "That's it. We're tired of this flip flopping. We're sending in the armies." And they sent in the armies and they took Jerusalem and they leveled the whole place and they destroyed the temple. It was gone until later reforms, a couple hundred years later. So Jeremiah saw that whole political game of back and forth between Egypt and Babylon and Egypt and Babylon. And he's like, but God, like you keep switching back to this one and then over to this one and this one, but God, like we got to remain faithful to God. God's the one that brought us here. God's the one that saw us through. God's the one that and they're like, yeah, but did you see the weapons that the Babylonians now have gotten? We're going to have to start capitulating to them. Or did you see what the Egyptians just started doing down there? I mean, all the stuff they're building down there. We're going to have to start flip-flopping back and forth and back and forth. And Jeremiah is this voice of warning that went unheeded, and he witnessed the destruction of his beloved town and temple and people brought off into exile. That's the story behind just that opening verse that said, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, the guy who found the law, of the priests who were in Anathoth, those exiled outsiders in the land of Benjamin. All of that history is supposed to be brought to our minds, but you're probably not a historian. So in their minds, that was more fresh. It was like that's what they learned about. This is the people. They were fine with that. We're separated by a couple millennia, so it's okay. You don't know that part, but that's in there, all in that one verse. And then Jeremiah has a call, and he's like, "Man, this job sucks. I do not like this job. Your God has called me to say these things to people who aren't going to listen, and then I'm going to have to watch the destruction of my town and people, all while saying, but guys, I told you so. Like, this is what I said was going to happen. And I'm watching it unfold. He's like, yeah, this job really sucks. I don't like it. So the next verse, now the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you prophet to the nations. The point of this verse is not to say, well, God is the one totally in control of your life and has everything all planned out before you, and you're going to do this and this and this. Got it all planned out. You just got to figure it out. Hopefully, you don't mess it up. It's not what he's trying to say here. There is an emphasis going on here. It's to move from the authority of the kings and that royalist tradition that is trying to move away from and puts all of the emphasis back on God. But their name for God was Yahweh. They're getting over this authoritarian monarchy and now they're under reforms. And they were good, but now they have no regard for God's law. They're trying to preserve like this political religious structure. That was priority number one, just king in the temple. That's good. And now all of that stuff, that whole religious system, that whole political system, we're then moving away from the king has all the say and all the power and all the authority. And Jeremiah is putting all of that on God. Because you can see here, he says, I formed you, I knew you, I consecrated you, I appointed you. Not saying that God is like this puppet strings pulling all the strings over, but the authority is now going from king and back over to God. God saying, I'm behind the scenes. I can see what's happening. I know what's going on. And I'm going to tell you what to say. I'm going to put you in there so you can say my words. So we're not supposed to pull these theologies of predestination, determinism out of this text, but to see it as a big shift in who has the authority to say things. So who formed you is my question. Like, who formed you? What ideas and what authorities do you give permission to shape those ideas? Like, who's forming your mind? Who's forming your heart? Who's informing them? Who's shaping those value systems? The answer is revealed when you encounter an idea or you encounter a like a person who says something and you're like, now why don't people just do this? Why don't people just see this? They should listen to this more than that. That reveals where the authority you have placed relies it. Maybe it's a news anchor, a TV personality, a podcaster, an authority, some pastor figure somewhere. Like, we hand out authority to other people to shape our ideas and our values without really thinking, should they be shaped that way? And Jeremiah comes in and he says, all of these people have been shaped to embrace whatever the king says and whatever the temple does is good, and whatever God's law says, take it or leave it. And he's saying, could we switch those things around? Could we put God's law first and say these things that God has written and commanded us to do and become, could that be the leading force that drives who we're becoming instead of these outside voices? So when those ideas and authorities are tied to supporting royalist agendas and societal structures that are built up, then it always gets tainted with some kind of agenda. And then we become an insider and we can't see the water that we're swimming in. And then we need an outsider to point some things out like us. That's the book of Jeremiah. He's the outsider pointing at all these things and saying, guys, it's time to change. So here, God is claiming the authority that comes with understanding. Like, the people that you're like, oh, that person really gets me. That person really understands what's important to me. Those are the people that have greater authority in our life. And this passage here is supposed to say God is claiming that authority with Jeremiah. He's like, I understand you. I'm the one who formed you. I'm the one who, like, I understand you. I have appointed you. I've consecrated you. I know you. And Jeremiah is like, the person who gets me. There it is. God. God gets me. God understands me. Now, here, he says this, but God, I don't know how to speak. I'm only a boy. The Lord said to me, do not say I'm only a boy. You shall go to all who I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Don't be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Now, Jeremiah like does this typical resist the call motif that we've seen before, like Moses. He's like, I can't talk. Get my brother Aaron. He knows how to talk. Then Isaiah, he's like, nah. I'm a man that does not have clean lips. Need some lip balm or something. I don't know. He's like, I have unclean lips. And then God says, no, I've chosen you. And then Jonah, he goes to the next level. He's like, I'm on the next boat out of here, guys. Like, God called me and was like, see ya, I'm gone. Like, the LinkedIn profile of these prophets would probably be something like Jonah, son of Amittai, prophet of Israel. I did not want this job, but here I am, stuck in a whale's belly. So that was Jonah. Now, God calls him when he's 17 years old. That also follows a motif of God picking the younger over the elder that we've seen before in Genesis: Abel, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Ephraim, Moses, David, Solomon. You can see a pattern here, right? And now all of a sudden he's picking Jeremiah. He's like, I'm young. Because youth were not seen as having a voice yet. There was a common belief that said anyone under 40 cannot understand the deeper things of God. There's like, at 10, you should be learning Bible. At 20, you should be learning this. 30, you should be learning this. At 40, now you can understand the mystical, deeper, mystic truths of whatever is going on here. So God's call overrides Jeremiah's excuses because it was never about his strength to begin with, but God's presence. So I don't know what your I could never is. Everyone has one of those. Like, but I could never do that. You know, it'd be cool, but I could never do that. Oftentimes, our I could never points to the very thing that you should be courageously exploring. Because the thing that you're afraid of is probably the thing that you're being invited into. That's what Jeremiah is experiencing here. It's like, hey, I'm going to choose you as a prophet, and you're going to go and say, oh, God, I could never do that. Like, and God's like, exactly. That's exactly why you're the one to do it, because you don't want to do it. If you wanted to do it, then you'd be the one grasping for all the power, but you don't want to do it. That's a good sign. Let's call this. You don't have to be a rock star. You don't have to be a Jedi Master Christian to understand what God has for you. I like the old Chinese proverb from Lao Tzu that says the journey of 1,000 steps begins where you stand. You can't start anywhere else than where you are. Today and who you are right now is where you start. That's where you start. You can't start anywhere else. And we always like punt the ball, right? Like, well, as soon as I get the education, get the whatever, get this, then I will. Newsflash, as somebody who said that over and over in my life, is like, well, as soon as I get a doctorate, then I will. And then I got the doctorate, and I'm like, well, now I don't have another excuse. Now what do I need to do? It's like, and I punted the ball for 10 years, and then finally said, I think I'm going to start writing and speaking and doing stuff. Because I didn't need the doctorate to do that. I'm grateful I got it. But what is the thing that you keep punting? You're just like, yeah, I don't really have enough education or mindset or health or this or that. One day I'll get there, but not yet because I'm not ready. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. But gosh darn it, people like you. Sorry, had to throw that in there. Why? What are you punting the ball on? Like, you can only start where you are with who you are. So start here, whatever it is. That's where Jeremiah had to understand. I can't because I'm too young. Call me when I'm 40. You know, that's when I understand the deeper truths. And God's like, no, I'm going to call you today. And don't worry about it because I'm with you. Because it wasn't about Jeremiah's performance. It was about Jeremiah's, or God's presence with Jeremiah. And God is with us. That's why we like that candle. This candle says God is with us and never forsakes us or leaves us. You don't have to like, well, one day I'll get around to that call that God has on my life to do the things. And it doesn't have to be a big ministry call, but whatever God is inviting you into, one day I'll do that. One day I'll say those things. I'll become that thing. I can tell you right now, the one day never happens. You have to start with today, wherever you are. So Jeremiah, last two verses of the chapter, he's learning to hope. Now, Jeremiah receives authority, much like Isaiah did some 200 years ago. Jeremiah has this, like, he has got the job of the propaganda machine kind of a thing. And what God says, Jeremiah says, I can't do that. I'm too young. And God says instead, just go. That is a Dumb and Dumber quote. If you don't get it, that's okay. We'll move on. But he literally says that. Just go. Don't stop talking. Just go. The royalists were saying, this is God's land, this is God's house, this is God's temple, and God promised David a throne that would never end. We're totally safe. We're totally good. And then Jeremiah steps in as a 17-year-old boy, and he's like, but if we don't spell out this law, if we don't live out the law that's spelled out in Deuteronomy, it actually says that we'll lose our land and our temple and our people. And they're like, nah, we're good. We're totally good. Now remember, Jeremiah's dad just found that book and he's been reading it. And he's like, wow, we got some work to do, guys. Those two factions have been fighting over who's right. God is sending Jeremiah to clear things up. And he says, I'm appointing you over nations and kingdoms, over them. That means that he's not going to be partisanly caught up in one side or the other. He's over top of them. He's not going to be like, I'm the pro-Egypt side. Let's go Egypt. And he's not going to be like, nah, actually, today I'm pro-Babylon. Let's go Babylon. We're going to beat the Egyptians together. He doesn't get into the fighting between the two different factions. He says, I'm appointing you over those nations, over those kingdoms, over those things. Means that you can't be partisan because you're over top of them and you have a top-down look at how broken both sides are. That's what he's saying. Because there was half a kingdom like, no, we need to be loyal to the throne and the temple, and maybe we can partner with Egypt and defeat Babylon. And then the other side is like loyal to the throne and the temple, but I think we should partner with Babylon. And he calls him out and says, actually, no, on those. We need to be faithful to God. And what Jeremiah is doing is he's critiquing the entire political imagination of the people. Because you can't be You can't be one or like, you can't be, you have to be in pro Egypt or pro Babylon. You can't be anywhere else. There's only two sides, guys, and you got to pick one. And Jeremiah is like, actually, no. I've been appointed over those nations, over those kingdoms. I have a top down look, and God's telling me things that we need to actually be thinking about. God's covenant and God's law is greater than the human political machines that we can build. Justice for the poor is greater than the temple rituals and the traditions that we perform. And false hopes need to be torn down in order for something good to grow. That's what he says at the end. Now, Jeremiah spoke into a time when Judah's leaders were clinging to false hopes and making bad alliances, going back and forth between Egypt and Babylon. He took himself off mute and um, he spoke out against both the international superpowers that were there and his own people who were lost in denial. He said hard things. He reminded people to be faithful to God first, and he didn't let anyone hijack his imaginations with any false hopes. He didn't let his own people co-opt his voice for their agenda. And he sided with the people and the poor, and he spoke up for them in the faces of those who had power. That's the job of a prophet. And he did it faithfully, and he did it well. So a couple questions for you to think about this week as we process Jeremiah. What excuses keep me muted when I should speak? Ooh, that was a good one. Where am I tempted to let politics or culture shape my imagination more than God's way? What false hopes do I need to tear down, and what true hope do I need to plant? These are some reflection questions to think about, and here's a spiritual practice to help you explore those. Before you begin the day, pray the prayer that Jeremiah prayed. God, put your words into my mouth and help me to use them wisely. Start your day with that 1, 2 sentences and see how the rest of your day goes. All right, our benediction is from Psalm 103, retold by Malcolm Guite. I'll invite our musicians back up. You drew me out of death and into you. You saved my life and crowned me with your love. I played you false, but you stayed strong and true. I sank below, but you reached from above and sent me firm on foundation, showed once more the way of mercy, truth, and love. You lifted from my shoulders the dark load of all my sin and flung it far from me, as far as east from west. Now all my road lies open with eager eyes. I see the places you prepared me to go, the tasks you have appointed and set for me. I know my weakness, but I also know your strength will be at work in me. For you cast down the mighty and exalt the low. Psalm 103, retold by Malcolm Guite.